Hello and welcome from our program, Strategic Compass for Harici Portal. And I'm glad to announce today we are joined by Professor Geoffrey Roberts. Geoffrey Roberts has been a prominent expert on Ukraine and Russia. He's been reading and writing on the conflict, but also on the causes of the conflict. And he lately actually articulated indeed, he underlined a possible peace plan for Ukraine at the Valdai discussion forum in early November 2014. Today, we are joined by him. Thank you very much, Geoffrey, for joining our program. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. Good to see you again.
Well, hopefully, if not anywhere else, then at the next Valdai Forum, hopefully, hopefully. We'll get together. And let's actually focus on the prospective peace for to bring an end to the conflict in Ukraine. Now, finally, Trump is in office. And he has actually speculated few points about to do this and the other. What he says doesn't seem to add up to something, because on the one hand, he says, I want Putin to end the conflict. I told him to end it. If I had been the president, there would have been no conflict. Then, and now I'm in the White House and I'm going to end the conflict, but Putin doesn't listen to what I say. You get all these confusing remarks by him. So first of all, let's start with them. What do you make of his statements about a prospective peace to end the war in Ukraine?
Well, Trump's discourse is as confusing as it's ever been. I mean, there is this kind of a maxim or adage about trying to understand Trump, trying to interpret Trump, is that you take him seriously, but you don't take him literally. So applying that.
This time we have to take him seriously, don't we?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Because he's the president, and he seems to have actually. Tamed the deep state opposing him.
Absolutely, and if we take Trump seriously, he is serious about peace in Ukraine, and he is serious about reconstructing United States relations with Russia, and he also seems to be serious, if we're to believe what his Secretary of State Rubio said just a few days ago. He's willing to engage with a constructive role in the emerging new multipolar polar world order. So all the signs coming from the Trump administration, as far as the war in Ukraine, as far as relations with Russia is concerned, and as far as the future of international politics, are on the whole good signs. Of course, there's things you could point to which point in different direction. For example, his position in relation to the Middle East, or his demand that Greenland becomes part of the United States, or his issues in relation to China. But as far as Ukraine and Russia is concerned, everything is looking positive from the peace perspective. But having said that, I'm not sure that Trump administration is going to make that much difference to when the war is going to end. It seems to me, the war will end. The war's ending will be determined by events on the battlefield, right? The war will end when Ukraine loses its combat capability, and that loss of combat capability provokes a domestic crisis within Ukraine, some kind of regime change. And that will open the door to serious peace negotiations with Russia. Now, I'm not so convinced that Trump and the United States are going to play a very important role in bringing the war to an end. But where they could obviously play a vital role is in helping to secure, to facilitate, a peace settlement. between Ukraine and Russia, and also a wider European and global peace settlement with Russia. So it's the importance as far as the future's peace is concerned, Trump, rather than what's going on in relation to the war at the present time.
Well, between what he says and what he does, there seems to be an important difference. At least it looks to me. For instance, on the one hand, as I earlier pointed out, what he says with regard to a prospective peace to end the war in Ukraine doesn't seem to add up. But at the same time, the fact that he stopped all the shipments, weapons shipments and the ammunition shipments to Ukraine, I think that would make a great difference, wouldn't it? Because he stopped it on the saying that there needs to be an auditing, and Zelensky's latest what Zelensky lately says also basically strengthens his statement about the need for auditing all these shipments.
Well, I mean, the Trump administration has stopped various forms of aid to Ukraine. It's not clear to me they've actually stopped military aid as such and military shipments. I think it'd be unrealistic to expect that that's going to happen. I think U.S. military aid to Ukraine will continue right the way through to the end of the war. But of course, it will continue at a much lower level than in the past, with no prospect whatsoever of it increasing or of having any real substantial impact on the course of the war. Because what the Ukrainians need now is not like more material, more U.S. military. They need soldiers to fight the war, and they're running out of people. They have this mobilization crisis, which obviously is the newspapers are full of. So I think the United States will continue supporting Ukraine right until the end, but when the end comes, I think that's when the United States will play a very important role in helping to broker the eventual peace settlement between Ukraine and Russia.
Okay, well, in terms of, again, what is happening on the battleground, as a military historian, you've been following the battlefield quite closely too. What do you see lately? For instance, it seems as if the Russian forces are just, overrunning the Ukrainian lines of defenses, and it might turn into a final rout on the part of the Ukrainian forces, on the battlefield, particularly psychologically. They must be very negatively affected by Trump's advent to power once again in the White House, and once again what he keeps saying, that the United States is not out there to basically support Ukraine financially, militarily, at least not to the same extent as the Biden administration. So all this would certainly impact negatively on the psychology of the Ukrainian forces.
Well, the Ukrainian armed forces has a huge morale problem at the moment, which is to do with the Trump administration, new Trump presidency. It's also to do with the astronomical desertion rates that they're facing, and most important, it's to do with the fact that the Russian advance is relentless. Okay, it's slow, but there's no sign of it's slackening. There's no sign that that Russia is running out of troops or weapons or anything like that. All the signs are that in the next few months, Ukraine is heading towards a decisive military defeat. Now, the political problem on Ukrainian side is that, okay, except for all but the most fanatical Ukrainian nationalists, it's clear where the war is going, and any kind of like sensible, rational basis, you'd want to call a halt, accept defeat, and salvage what you can from it. But the problem was, calling a halt, accepting Russian terms, a ceasefire, neutral conditions, whatever they might be, that will have an even bigger impact on the morale and combat capability of the Ukrainian armed forces, and will certainly precipitate an internal domestic political crisis and a split internally. So as soon as Ukraine makes serious moves toward peace, that will be the end of its fighting capabilities, and also the end of the present regime. So from a political point of view, you just hang on in there, don't you? You just keep going for as long as possible, right? And I think that what that implies is that the war, will continue for a lot longer than it should continue, or you'd imagine it to continue, because the Ukrainians will just continue continue fighting. Yeah. The problem is, of course, while the war continues, Ukraine is suffering more and more losses. Ukrainian economy, society is being further destroyed. The whole future of Ukraine as an independent sovereign state is becoming more and more existential. And and going back to the Trump question, I don't think Trump coming in is going to make a decisive difference in terms of nudging, the present regime towards some kind of a peace negotiation. At least there's no sign of that so far. There's no sign that Zelensky is seriously moving in the direction of peace in response to the pressures coming from the United States. So they're going to continue fighting. And if they can hold it together, if they can avoid a complete collapse, then yes. And if they can retreat in an orderly way, yeah. I'm not convinced that there will be any kind of precipitate military collapse on Ukrainian side.
Well, the question of Zelensky basically residing now from the Russian point of view, the fact that Zelensky is there is a non-starter, isn't it? Because they keep saying, they made it quite clear that Zelensky has lost all his legitimacy. His term ended, and there's been no elected president. So as long as he is there, as you put it, there is no chance that the Russians would actually negotiate with someone with Zelensky. They could only perhaps negotiate with the United States, and perhaps only with the United States, one way or the other. They wouldn't necessarily negotiate with any European leader either, because all the European governments have also lost their legitimacy in the eyes of the Russians, because they lied so much about this and the other. They were present in the signing of the Minsk agreements. And then one of them, Merkel was on. She even said that they signed up to the treaties in order to buy out time for Ukraine. So how do you see all that? From the Russian point of view, first of all, from a technical negotiating position, would they ever negotiate with Zelensky? Yeah. Because they keep saying no.
Yeah, look, if there's going to be a series of negotiations, peace negotiations, which end the war and lead to some kind of settlement, it's going to be between Russians and Ukrainians. Yeah, just like it was in Istanbul in the spring of 2022. Okay, there will be third parties involved in that process in various ways. United States, of course, European countries, actually global South countries, Turkey, China, India, Brazil, and so on. But fundamentally, it will be a negotiation between Ukraine and Russia. Okay, and what Okay, in relation to those negotiations, the Russian position is, at least as stated by Putin, and actually, whatever Putin states, that's the Russian position. Don't take any notice of what anyone else might say. Always focus on what Putin is saying. What Putin is saying is, he says, yes, yeah, we're willing to negotiate with the present regime. That doesn't necessarily mean, of course, direct personal negotiations with Zelensky, but we're willing to negotiate with the present regime, right? But the problem is we can't sign an agreement with the present regime because it's illegitimate, it's unconstitutional, right? Because there needs to be elections, right, before you get a properly constituted government in Ukraine, which actually can sign a peace agreement. And the other thing Putin is saying, said this just a few days ago, is that, you know, look, you know, the Ukrainians have this constitutional provision, or this, maybe it's not constitutional, but certainly legislation, law, that prohibits them from negotiating peace with Russia. So the first thing that has to happen before there can be any negotiation with anyone is that that legislation, that act prohibiting negotiating with Russia, has to be rescinded. Then we can have a negotiations with whatever regime is in power. But then the first stage, of course, you need to sign an agreement with a regime which has, you know, legality and which has constitutionality. But going back to my point I made before, as soon as Zelensky, and it can only, I think, unless he's overthrown somehow or disposed of, it can only come from him, from his office. As soon as Zelensky makes the move to actually repudiate or, you know, rescind this legislation, barring negotiations, that is what will set off an immense internal political crisis in Ukraine, leading to his downfall. I'm certain of that. Which is of course the reason why he's not going to do it. So I keep talking myself back into the position is that, you know, there's not going to be any peace negotiations until you have regime change in Kiev, right? And you're not going to get regime change in Kiev until you get to the point at which the Ukrainians really are on the edge of catastrophic military defeat, and it makes no sense for them to, you know, continue. It makes no sense whatsoever to continue the war. Now, where that point arrives at, I'm not so sure, but I think it's going to come in the next few months.
Okay.
I really don't see the war going on much beyond the summer of this year.
Okay. Well, I think you're right. You know, almost everyone expresses similar views that this war cannot go on for much longer, because Ukraine is basically it has run out all its resources. You know, in terms of manpower, in terms of perhaps weapons and ammunition, soon to be quite pervasive all around, you know, and then Ukraine is going to run out of steam. Now, now let's move then on to the basics of a settlement, you know, with a Ukrainian government. What would the Russians, you think, demand? You know, if the Minsk agreements had been implemented, there would have been no war. Would you agree? And now, however, would the implementation of the Minsk agreements be enough for Russia to basically accept a final deal with a Ukrainian regime friendly with Russia, and with the insertion of a major clause into the Ukrainian constitution that can never be basically changed constitutionally, that Ukraine is going to remain a neutral country, that sort of thing? Because there are also Russian demands, as they made it through the war, that they want complete denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine, one form or the other. I mean, a defeat on the battlefield, a decisive defeat, would ensure that, you know, there's no Nazi forces around, or they would leave the country one way or the other. How, you know, what would you like to say all about that?
Sure. Well, I mean, Putin's terms for peace with Ukraine were set out in his speech, a statement he made in June. What he proposed there, well, he didn't use this term, this is my term, he proposed what is in effect an armistice, yes, right? But the terms of the armistice, well, the two most important terms of the armistice were, one, that Ukraine had to concede Crimea and the 4 provinces that have already been incorporated into Russia, were incorporated in October 2022. And secondly, should also declare that it won't join NATO. It will be a neutral state. Okay, and then plus Putin alluded to other things like denazification and treatment of Russian-speaking minorities in Ukraine. But the key demands were the territorial concession by Ukraine and a declaration that it would be a neutral state, which of course would be a return to, you know, to its original neutral status when it emerged from the Soviet Union after the Soviet collapse in 1991. And Putin said that if Ukraine accepts that, withdraws its troops from these territories which we consider to be ours, then we can get into detailed peace negotiations, the details of the peace. Now, as far as I know, Putin hasn't changed that position. That's the position. And what he's also said, connected to that, is that the basis for the detailed peace negotiations that would follow this armistice, right, would be the kind of agreements that were arrived at in Istanbul in the spring of 2022, and those were draft treaties about Ukraine's neutrality, but also crucially about Ukraine's future level of armaments. Yeah, its military, you know, the levels of its military. Now, a lot of these, you know, a lot of the details of what were being discussed in Istanbul were unresolved, right? But the general principle was that Ukraine would be neutral, and it would also be demilitarized to the extent that its level of its armed forces would be quite limited, so that they would no longer pose a threat to Russia. And Putin's constantly said that's where we start from. That's the starting point. Is what was agreed, what was negotiated in Istanbul. But of course, you know, the situation has changed radically in the last 3 years, and those Istanbul agreements will need to be updated to reflect that changed reality. And the most fundamental part of that changed reality is the fact that Russia has now either occupied or is going to occupy not just Crimea, but the 4 provinces: Zaporozhye, Kherson, Lugansk, and Donetsk. So yeah, if the Ukrainians would agree to those armistice terms, the war could come to an end very quickly indeed. Yeah, in fact, Putin said himself, he said it can come to an end immediately. And in fact, we will guarantee that the Ukrainian military can retreat in good order from the areas of these 4 provinces that remains under its occupation. But of course, it goes back to the point that I made earlier, is that were Ukraine, whichever regime, to accept the Russian demands, that would lead to a collapse of its military position, and also this internal domestic crisis. So I'm inclined to say that actually what's going to happen at some point in the future, is once you get to a situation where Russia is more or less in control of the vast majority of the territory, Ukrainian territory that it claims, I think at that point, some Kiev regime is actually going to accept the Russian terms, including a declaration of neutrality. That's the way. That's the only way I can see the war coming to a negotiated end. Now, of course, that may not happen. You know, the war could go on indefinitely. Yeah, the Ukrainians could keep fighting. They could retreat behind the Dnieper, set up defensive lines there, and you know, and continue to fight on. If that scenario materializes, it seems to be most likely that Putin, the Russians, will take the initiative, and once they've achieved their stated goals, they will actually, you know, not halt the war, not stop the war, not unilaterally stop the war, but certainly curtail their military operations and adopt a more defensive posture designed to, you know, to protect the territories that they've occupied.
Well, one point that it intrigues me is that if Putin is going to insist on the incorporation of those 4 provinces, you know, that he declared, I mean, he signed away their incorporation into motherland Russia, if you like, then what would the Russians want, you know, the use of Russian language and all that for? Because the Russian-speaking parts would then be mainly incorporated into Russia. Or do you think he keeps this option of turning Ukraine into a small Soviet Union with 2 founding states, 2 founding nations, both, you know, absolutely independent, but coming together out of their free will to create a new Ukrainian state? So that would give some semblance of Ukrainian territorial integrity, except, of course, Crimea. But then it would also make any Ukrainian ruler very conducive to Russian concerns. Otherwise, you know, at any moment, Ukraine would be broken into pieces again. So do you think the Russians have that or are keeping that at the back of their mind, at that possibility? Or, you know, those 4
I mean, there are a lot of discussions and speculations along those lines and various kind of schemes that come. It strikes me as being a bit too complicated and, you know, unpredictable. I find it hard to believe that from a practical, political, strategic point of view, that's the kind of thinking that Putin is engaging in. You know, it seems to me, you know, the fundamental position is that, you know, these territories that have been incorporated into Russia are going to remain part of Russia. Yeah, maybe not all, by the way. I mean, I think there's still a little bit of wiggle room for negotiation about the precise frontiers of, you know, well, particularly of Kherson and Zaporozhye. But basically, those territories are and will remain forever a part of Russia as far as Putin is concerned. And, you know, fundamentally, Russian military operations, right, are you know, in a strategic sense, are focused on actually completing the occupation of those incorporated territories. Yeah. Particularly the rest of Lugansk and Donetsk, basically advancing towards the Kramatorsk-Slavyansk-Konstantinovka line. Once they get there, you know, more or less the goal, the military strategic goal of the special military operation would have been achieved. Yeah, okay, so that will mean that the majority of Russian speakers will be under, you know, part of Russia, from henceforth. But that will still leave lots of millions of Russian speakers within what's left of Ukraine, right? And part of any peace deal, if there is a peace deal, will be negotiations about protecting the rights, positions, the identity of either Russian speakers in what's left of Ukraine, or or pro-Russia Ukrainians. Because it's not just a question of not just Russian speakers in Ukraine that identify with Russia. It's actually Ukrainian speakers as well, not so many of them, obviously. Yeah. So part of any peace deal will be securing the position of Russian language, culture, and Russian supporters in Ukraine itself. But another scenario that's often talked about is that Putin wants to achieve his goals, and then he just wants to create a situation whereby Ukraine becomes a failed state, a fragmented state, some kind of basket case, rump state, yes, which is not his problem. It becomes the West's problem, becomes Poland's problem, or the EU's problem, the United States. Just let them get on with it. I don't believe that that's the case, because that's a far too unstable situation from a Russian point of view, right? What Russia wants to, I think, wants to achieve its goals, right, as stated, but also it wants to see emerge in Ukraine itself some kind of stable regime with which it can actually do business with, and can actually establish some kind of constructive relationship. I mean, you started our conversation, mentioning the Valdai conference last November. It was actually, and at that conference, as you know, as everyone knows, is that Putin comes along towards the end of the conference and he gives a big keynote speech, and then there are questions from the floor. Well, I was there, you were there. I had my hand up to actually ask the question. I wasn't called, but the question I wanted to ask Putin, and actually it's a question I subsequently put to the Russian ambassador in London when I had a conversation with him a couple of months ago. The question I wanted to put was, well, okay, what will Russia do to help Ukraine and Ukrainians recover from the war once the war is over, once there is a peace? Because Putin has always said that Ukraine can only be fully free, independent, and prosperous in association with Russia. Talks constantly about Ukrainians being Russian blood brothers, and that's not just Russian speakers; that's Ukrainian speakers as well. If that's the case, so what is Russia going to do to help Ukraine reconstruct in the post-war period? And actually, I think that in terms of any negotiated peace settlement, one that's going to be as acceptable as possible to Ukraine and its people, that kind of dimension of Russian support and aid for Ukraine's post-war reconstruction could be a very, very vital element in leading to a successful negotiation, and also to some kind of treaty, some kind of settlement, which is going to be able to sustain itself.
Well, okay.
Unfortunately, I wasn't able to answer the question. But when I asked the Russian ambassador,
I also raised my hand, and I was going to ask him the question about Syria, and did he, had he actually given up the mediation between Turkey and Syria, and what's going on? I was going to ask him. I wish I had asked him, because the unfolding events demonstrated that would have been a good question, and whether he would have answered it, to the liking of all of us over there who take an interest in Syria. I don't know, but Putin is quite. On the one hand, he's quite secretive, perhaps, just as any leader would be, but at the same time, he can always make his position quite clear. This is what I basically make of his statements and declarations, and also his office's declarations.
Yeah.
Now, one other thing.
I think Putin is the clearest spoken political leader
in
the world today. I mean, without any doubt whatsoever. Yeah. I think you can basically take Putin at his word. Now, it's not to say he doesn't lie, he doesn't dissemble. Of course, he's a politician. He doesn't tell you everything. But when he says he wants peace on these terms, I think you can believe that, right? So
certainly,
ending the war, peace, a sustainable peace, is not fundamentally a problem on the Russian side, although Putin has his own issues there. Of course, there's Russian hardliners who don't want to make any compromises, all that kind of. It's fundamentally a problem on the Ukrainian side and the Western side. And it's how the dynamics play out in the Western United States and in Ukraine. That's going to determine if and when the war ends, and if and when we're able to salvage from this catastrophe, a reasonable peace deal. But sorry, your question.
We are basically, we have about 10 minutes left, but you have two short questions. Now, the first is about the Europeans' attitude. Now, who is going to come to power in Germany in the upcoming elections? We don't know, and what government is going to be formed. But the Europeans appear to be on their high horse still, despite the fact that Trump doesn't take the Ukrainian conflict as seriously as the Biden administration. Plus, he demands Greenland of Finland, and then what else? What other sanction he has in mind against the Europeans and all that? They keep saying that they are going to bolster up Ukraine. Do you think the Europeans could ever be an impediment in the peace negotiations, or could they really bolster up Ukraine, to carry on fighting, absent the United States shipments of weapons and what have you? Would you buy those arguments ever?
No. Short answer is no. They don't have the capability. I think it's basically also sure. Europe is providing a good amount of support to Ukraine, but they know what they can substitute for the kind of support that the United States has been giving Ukraine. At the moment, there's all this talk about Europe has got to build up its own defences. What was it late? There needs to be a 500 billion common European defence budget. All kinds of, but as far as I can see, there's no reality to it, and there's certainly no political reality because this kind of doesn't have the support of European citizens. The majority of European citizens, as far as I can see, all the information we have shows that they won't have any truck with this kind of military, and they don't buy into this narrative of some existential threat from Russia to Europe itself. They're sympathetic to Ukraine in its cause, but mostly they want the war to come to an end. Even they favour a compromised peace, and they favour a settlement of relations with Russia. Why militarization? Why are you preparing for war against a non-existent threat? Most people using their common sense can see, Russia poses an existential threat to Ukraine, but it doesn't pose an existential threat to the rest of Europe. So the way forward is not militarization. The way to actually, interesting point. Cast your mind back when Gorbachev came to power. His new thinking. One of his main arguments. Look, you can't get peace. You can't have security unless you employ politics. Politics is the way to achieve security in Europe and globally, and that remains true today. Develop a political relationship with Russia, which will safeguard European security. That's what needs to happen.
Well, thank you on that, because actually I was going to ask the question because that narrative is being used, indeed overused by European politicians and NATO Secretary General and all the others. You know, that if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, then basically you need to go to Russian courses and learn Russian, because Russia is going to overwhelm the rest of Europe, and then we are all going to be forced to be Russified one way or the other. You know, this sounds absolutely nonsensical to me, but given the fact that, for instance, Turkey has the largest territory in the European basically continent, up to the Ural Mountains, okay? And Russia is 20 times that of Turkey. But in terms of population, the Russian population is around 140 million. You know, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's just around 140. Whereas, for instance, the Soviet Union had a population of about 160 plus million, having lost 27 millions in the Second World War, when Turkey had only 27 million, 18 million population. So the Russian losses in the Second World War was about 1.5 Turkey. But, you know, many of the experts expect that in about 30, 40 years' time, Turkey and Russia will have, you know, equal amount of population one way or the other. Now, so you are talking about a country with huge territorial landscape, yes, but at the same time, it doesn't have a huge population like China, for instance, that can actually, with which it can conquer further territories and colonize those territories and all that. So that narrative particularly seem to have originated from the Eastern Europeans, the Baltics and Romanians, and the Poles, is now being overused by the Europeans. You know, from what you've said earlier on, you don't buy that narrative either.
No, it's well, as you said, it's a nonsensical narrative, and I don't think most European citizens would buy that narrative. Russia does not pose a security threat to Europe, but it could do in the future if Europe prepares for war with Russia. Right, you know, militarizes its societies, right, gets involved in all kinds of conflicts, tensions, confrontation. Yeah, sure, you can, you know, you can certainly create a Russian threat to Europe, but it will be on Europe, not on Russia, right? Yeah, there is no such threat, right? What Europe needs to do is to, and actually. That, of course, is to go back to a discussion about Ukraine. Well, that's the story of Ukraine, right? Why did Putin invade Ukraine? It's because a threat was created within Ukraine, created by Western meddling in Ukraine, by the United States, by Europe. They created what Putin saw as a strategic threat, so he launched a special military operation to deal with that strategic military threat. Whereas, you know, had there been a collaboration with Russia, cooperation, negotiation, compromises, there would have been no Ukraine war, right? And what there would have been a shared European security space, which would include Russia, and also, of course, other countries such as Turkey as well. Can I make one final point about the whole peace process? Yeah, okay. So we've been talking about Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and the United States, but let's not forget third parties like Turkey. Yeah, like China, like India. They can play a very, very important role in facilitating a negotiated peace settlement once we get to the point in which serious negotiations are feasible. And I think in terms of influencing Putin, those countries will be the most important factor influencing Putin, and there'll be a factor influencing Putin in the direction of peace and in the direction of making some compromises, even some risky compromises. Yes, taking some chances in order to end the war, make sure it doesn't resume, and that there is some kind of stable peace is established.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It was very nice talking to you about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, basically covering all the aspects of it. And thank you very much. Unless you have anything to add, we can actually conclude here.
No, thanks very much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to talking to you again, meeting you again. If I don't see you, hopefully I'll see you in Sochi in October, if not before.
Hopefully, yes, and then we'll exchange lots of views. By then, what's going to happen? We don't know.
But then we'll know what's happened. The things I've been saying turned out to be true, or sensible anyway.
And hopefully by October, the war would come to an end in Ukraine, and we would be talking about the new peace agreement and implementation of that. And
I hope so, but my predictions about peace coming to Ukraine have proven to be wrong so far. But okay, I'll make the prediction again here on stream. I think by October the war will be over, or at least nearly over, or we'll be in a peace process of some kind. Yeah,
hopefully. Well, thank you again. And with this, we conclude today's program. And for the next program, we'll have another topic and another prominent expert to discuss what's going on in the world. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.